Let's start out just by talking about Asia Minor. Where is that? So here we're taking off from Florida across the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, the modern-day country of Turkey, right in the center of the screen. There were a number of cities, and you'll find these cities in the book of Revelation. Here's where they were all located. John wrote the book of Revelation while he was in exile for Christianity, for his faith in Jesus. He was in exile on the island of Patmos, which you can see in the middle of the Aegean Sea. Ephesus, we have in our Bible a book to the Ephesians. That was to the Christians who are in Ephesus, was a major city of the day. And then you see Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira and Sardis and Philadelphia and Laodicea. And here's what I'd like to do before we actually get to chapters 2 and 3. I'd like you to look back at chapter 1 and look at verse 9. That's where I'll begin. This is what we read. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that is ours in Jesus. And John here is the disciple of Jesus. After many years, Christians had scattered. John had moved to Ephesus. We know he carried on a very powerful ministry there. But later on in his life, he was in exile because he was being persecuted for his faith. And so he had been moved to this island. He says that he was there in exile. He says, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Verse 10, on the Lord's day, so on a Sunday, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Now, the book of Revelation, I don't know how many of you have taken the time to read it. If you have, it can give you the impression that it's very ethereal. And while it's true that there are a lot of signs and symbols in this book, I want you to know that it's not just ethereal. It was live, and it was grounded in the reality of what was going on. I want you to look at the order of the cities, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. John was on Patmos, and if a courier was to go from Patmos and visit each of these cities, you'll see that probably he'd land first in Ephesus, and you could take a road which circled through all these major cities, one in order. So this isn't ethereal or not grounded in reality. These were real churches with real struggles, and letters were written to each of these churches, and you could see how a courier, the order here, would make his way from one church to the next. And then if you just look at chapters 2 and 3, you'll see that there are 7 letters that were written. These Christians were struggling with how to be Christians in a world that was persecuting them, that was deeply pagan. They were struggling with how to be light and salt. And so in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, to the angel of the church in Ephesus. And probably the Greek word which is translated here, angel, means something like messenger. Probably this was written to the pastors and to the churches as a whole. So this is probably addressing the pastors of the churches when it talks about the angel of the church in Ephesus. If you look at chapter 2, verse 8, you'll see there's a letter there to the angel or the pastor or the messenger in the church in Smyrna, which would be the second city as he went along. If you look at verse 12, the very next letter would have been written to the church which is in Pergamum, which is the next city. And then if you look in chapter 2, verse 18, you'll see to the angel of the church of Thyatira, which is the next city. And then if you look at chapter 3, in verse 1, you see a letter that was written to the church in Sardis. Beginning in verse 7, you see a letter that was written to the church in Philadelphia. And then in verse 14, a letter to the church that was in Laodicea. And so these churches were struggling with how to follow Christ in an authentic and powerful way in a culture which was very pagan and even against them. And God himself has a message for these churches. Now, we don't have the time today. As a family, we did have the opportunity to go to each one of these places except for Philadelphia. We didn't have the opportunity to go there, but we did put our feet down on the ground in each one of these other cities. There's no way to convey it all. So I'm going to focus in on just one city, one letter, to Sardis, which is in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. And the reason I decided to focus in here is because I think there's something so relevant for Christians today. Let's read that letter together, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 3. It says, "To the angel," or again here, messenger, probably the pastor, "of the church in Sardis write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars." By the way, that's a description of Jesus. If you take the time to go read chapter 1, you'll see that there's this amazing, just majestic picture of Jesus that's laid out when John first sees him. And this is a title that's referring to Jesus, the one who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. There's this picture of Jesus holding the pastors and the churches in his hands, so to speak. "I know your deeds." And then he writes, "You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead." Verse 2, "Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard, hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me, dressed in white, for they're worthy. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches." Going back to verse 1, where Jesus says, "I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you're dead." Very fascinating to me that already individual congregations in individual cities had a reputation, so to speak. They were known for things. And I think that's generally true. I mean, different congregations, even in our city, are kind of known for one thing or for the other. There's a reputation. And the reputation here, while outwardly is very good. I mean, you're known for just being alive. The reality, the underlying reality, does not match that as Jesus sees it. He sees beyond kind of outward expressions and what other people say. He sees the reality. He says, you have this reputation, like, wow, you're really doing it, but in fact, you're dead. And I can say this, as I walk the streets of Sardis, it's almost like you could see that this church was, they really had a profound witness. They were not, if you will, hiding it under a bowl. They weren't trying to keep it to themselves. One of the things you'll see, this is first a comment about the Jewish people who lived there. The city of Sardis, it was a well-known, very wealthy, large city. It was at one time one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire. We've hardly heard of it today, but in its day, it was one of the most amazing places. There was a Jewish population there, and they actually have the largest synagogue outside of Israel was built there. And I'll show you a couple pictures, because when you stand in the synagogue, it's quite impressive. This is a picture of that synagogue, and I show you this picture because you could see what the floors were like, mosaics built with these tiny stones across the entire floor, artwork on the walls, some of which still remains there. That's just incredible. This one synagogue was about the same size as a football field. So here's a second picture. You can get a sense of how long that football field-like synagogue was. Very large. Seemed very much alive. I'll show you a picture. There's a fountain at the entrance. Whoa, really touchy today. A really grand entrance at this synagogue. And it's actually the next picture that's the most impressive to me. They didn't build this synagogue in some obscure place outside of the city. They built it right at the heart. And keep in mind, this is a pagan city. The idea of worshiping God was just far from most people there. They were polytheists, which means they worship a lot of different kinds of God. They were engaged in all kinds of idolatry and all kinds of immorality, and yet right in the city center. Here, I'll show you this picture. This is that synagogue. I don't know if you can see what's next to it. That is the gymnasium of the city. What was the gymnasium? Well, there was a large city center with a huge square. This was a place of learning. Here's a picture of us right in front of it with two of my daughters. Behind that, you see the big arched doorway there. There was just a huge bathhouse. And when I say there was a huge bathhouse, all the kinds of things that you can imagine happen in a bathhouse happen in that bathhouse. Where we're standing, there's just a huge courtyard. And now I'll go just back to this picture. That you've got to think about. It's in the heart of the city, where the city's throbbing and thriving. There's all kinds of immorality and everything that's happening there. Where was it that God's people set their synagogue? Not in some obscure place. Right there. Right there. I mean, it's literally attached by columns. Now, that was the Jewish people. When the message of Christ got there, did they do the same thing or did they do something different? And as we went through the city, you can see that Christians did exactly the same kind of thing. One of the things that Sardis was known for is that it had a huge temple to the goddess Artemis, who was the goddess of fertility. And again, if you can imagine that you have a huge temple to the goddess of fertility, you can imagine the kinds of things that happened there. It actually was twice the size of the Parthenon. I don't know how many of you have seen the Parthenon in Athens. This was, in its day, twice the size. Here's a picture of some of the remnants. This is kind of walking up toward the temple where it was. You can see the broken down columns. I love this next picture. Two of my daughters are in it, and I think of all the pictures I took, at least for me, you probably won't appreciate it the same way, but at least for me, I just love this picture. I have such a great memory of taking it even. They got up on one broken down column, and they're actually standing like way up in the air as I took their picture. But you can see the majestic columns in the background and the remnants of the temple. Two things that I want to point out. In the background, do you see that mountain? On that mountain was the Acropolis, the high part of the city. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. But down in the very lower right-hand corner of the picture, do you see there's like a small building next to it? That small building was one of the very first Christian churches there. And, so touchy. There we go. Here's a picture. Again, these Christians weren't hiding their faith under a bushel. They weren't keeping it in some corner just trying to hide out and make sure. They were right next to the temple of Artemis. They built their church. They were living their faith in a very public way. It appears to me they were doing their best to be salt and light. One more picture that I want to show you. There's this main street where all the shops were. And one particular shop was of a person who worked in textiles, and they dyed clothes. And they had a tub there where they had the dye and put the cloths down in. And it's clear that this person was a Christian, and you'll see this is a picture of that tub. Those of you who are in the front, you may see this better than those of you in the back. But there are two crosses that are there. What you may or may not see is that there was writing on there. And as archaeologists have taken a look at this, they have actually deciphered what was written under there, and it was an inscription to pagan gods. And apparently the owner of the shop, who at one point was committed to some worship of some other god, finally said, forget that, and he scrubbed down on these rocks as best he could that inscription and carved the crosses in. This is right on Main Street. I hope you see this. I mean, public, saying, I follow Jesus, in a very public way. And so, when Jesus says you have a reputation for being alive, this was a church who was, they weren't in some obscure corner of the city who were doing nothing. They were trying to impact their culture in the most profound and deep way. They were there. They were at it, so to speak. And anyway, let me go back to this picture. As we look at this next part, it says you have a reputation of being alive, but you're dead. In other words, Jesus, although there's a public perception, he sees the inner reality. And verse 2, he says, wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you've received and heard, hold fast to it, and repent. It says, if you do not wake up, I'll come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. I'd like to talk about that Acropolis. Wake up. That's what Jesus is calling these people to. Outwardly, everything looks good, but inwardly, I know how you are. Wake up, he says. And it's clear, as you look very carefully at this letter, that the problem in this church in Sardis is what you might call complacency. They, in some way or another, feel secure. They feel like they're doing the right things. They believe that everything's all right, when in reality, the one who judges them says it's not. Wake up! Wake up! This message, especially this last part, if not, I'll come like a thief in the night, I think would have had very special meaning to the people of Sardis. This Acropolis in the background, I don't know if you can see it very well, but the cliffs there are just incredibly steep. I mean, there's no trail up that's discernible. And at the top of that mountain, there was a fortress that was up there, a place where, in fact, in its day, this is what it was known for. It was known for being an unconquerable city. Conquering Sardis was sort of known across the ancient world as like the impossible task. Getting to the top of that Acropolis and conquering it was like, I don't know, for us, going to the moon. I mean, the average, it's just, you can't do it. You cannot do it. It's unconquerable, so to speak, except that this Acropolis was actually, and because of complacency, was toppled not once, but twice. And both times it was toppled because people believed they were absolutely secure. There was no way in. No one could do anything. Their kings became, I think this is a great word, their kings became complacent. They said, well, we're safe up here. Very wealthy city. I don't know how many of you heard of the Midas touch? Okay, everyone, right? The Midas touch, apparently there was a king. His name was Midas, and he was known for being wealthy and actually vain. He apparently at one point or another prayed or asked that everything he touched would turn to gold, and this became part of Greek mythology because Greek mythology says that actually he starved to death. Because when he touches food, it became gold. When he touches water, it became gold. And he lived right here. In fact, there's a river called the Pectolis River that runs through Sardis. And mythology and legend has it that he went to try to bathe in the river to get rid of all the gold, but the waters just flowed gold behind him. And this place was known as just a place of incredible wealth. There was a king in the 5th century BC. His name was Croesus. He was known at that time as the wealthiest man in the entire world because this was a place of gold and wealth and luxury. He had this incredible fortress at the top of this Acropolis. And in fact, here, I shouldn't forget to show you this. I have a picture. The very first gold coins that we know were ever minted were minted by this Croesus who reigned at the top of that mountain. Here's just a picture of one of those gold coins that has been recovered. Croesus felt absolutely secure in the 5th century BC. The king of Persia, actually, he's mentioned in the Bible, his name is Cyrus, decided to go and invade Sardis. And Croesus, he gathered all the people up on the Acropolis and he thought, there's no way they're coming in here. There's no way. And Cyrus and his army laid siege around the city. They felt so secured that apparently Croesus didn't even bother stationing the kind of appropriate army around the wall. And his complacency actually went down to his inferiors. And so even the soldiers who were standing at the wall weren't watching guard or keeping the appropriate level of awareness. And the story is told that there were two soldiers, they were talking, and one of the soldiers took his helmet off and set it on the wall. And while they were talking, he started gesturing with big arms and bloomp, knocked his helmet down off the wall, and it went flying down. So here, just so you can visualize this in your mind. Oh no, my helmet. Apparently, there was a Persian soldier who was watching this, and he just kind of crouched down in the bushes and waited to see what would happen. And that guard thought to himself, well, I can't go without my helmet. And there was no known trail up, known to other people, but apparently he made the trail known when he decided to come down, get his helmet, and then make his way back up. And the Persian soldier who was watching on said, aha, that's the way up. And so he went and told Cyrus that night. And in the middle of the night, when everyone was asleep, no one was imagining anything was going to happen, wham, the Persians came and they destroyed the city. So, what was Sardis most known for? There were actually fables that were told to children about how King Croesus and his complacency allowed the unconquerable fortress to be plundered by King Cyrus. So in history, it's like, what was the problem in Sardis, kind of writ large? It was complacency. And what happened in the middle of the night when you least expect it? Destruction. And so I believe actually Jesus' words, they have like a special meaning to these Christians. The same problem that has plagued your city for centuries is now plaguing you. You feel secure. You feel like everything's fine. You have this reputation of being alive. But the inner reality is you've grown complacent. And as Jesus judges it, you're actually dead. I think it's important to get the full picture. Look with me at verse 4. It says, yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me dressed in white, for they are worthy. So here's the real picture. As a whole, the church was complacent. There were a lot of people who they thought they were secured, but they weren't. But there was this, if you will, inner core that was sincere, that really walked with Jesus. And Jesus takes the time to reassure them, listen, I know who you are as well. And although, on the grand scale, the church is complacent and isn't walking with me at all, I know you. Your clothes are white. I will not forget you. Your names are written in the book of life. They will not be blotted out, he goes on to say. And so that's the real reality. There is this inner core who really are passionate, who really are serving Jesus. Maybe they're among those who are doing everything they can to in a public way, shine the light of Jesus. But then there's all the rest of the church that's just along for the ride, so to speak. And that's what I want to talk about today. Maybe we'll call this the comfortable pew. Okay? And I think it's relevant to, as an example, the church in America. The comfortable pew. Where maybe at one point there was a lot of vitality to faith, and maybe there still are those who are radically committed to Jesus and shining his light and living for him. But there are those who just are outwardly going through the motions, who the inward reality doesn't meet the outward appearance. And I believe this message, which is stark, wake up, is something probably many of us need to hear. Let's drill down. I'm going to just try this. There are 3 parables in Matthew chapter 13, parables that I personally love. In fact, I've talked about them here in church. And, well, that's not fair. Most of the time when I talk about these parables, I often just talk about the first 2. But it's very clear that all 3 of them are supposed to go together. And so today, we're going to talk about the third one probably more than the first 2. But you can't understand the third one until I talk about the first 2. Here's what they are. They're actually very short. The first one in verse 44 of Matthew chapter 13, which says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. So in my mind, this is how I see the parable. There's a certain person, he's walking along, he's trying to get somewhere. In fact, in my mind, I think he's going into town fast. He decides to take a shortcut through someone's field. He's probably got a walking stick. As he goes along, clunk, his stick hits something. He wonders what that was. He turns back, he digs it up, and there were no banks at the time, and so if you had a lot of money and you wanted to keep it safe, you did this kind of thing. You buried it in a place that only you knew. And clunk, he opens this up and he realizes that maybe hundreds of years before someone did this very thing. They hid a treasure in the field. He kind of pushes the dirt away, and then he opens it up and he sees what his eyes can't believe. There is a treasure there of inestimable worth, and he can't believe, I can't believe I found this. And now he realizes there's a problem. Because if he was to just take it, the owner of the field may someday, when he has it, say, hey, that was mine. It was in my field, it's mine. And so, realizing the situation, he says, okay, let me close this back up. He pushes the dirt back over it. And this is what he does. He goes out. He sells all his possessions. He gathers together enough money. He goes to the man who owns the field and says, listen, I'm going to buy your field. How much do you want? And just everything he has, he pushes across the table. And when he owns that field, now the treasure there is his. In the process, there's actually two parts to this parable. First is the discovery, and then the possession. So the first part, he just, thwack. He unearths it. He discovers, whoa, there's a treasure here. And then there's the possession. And, of course, Jesus, when he tells this parable, he's talking about the kingdom of heaven. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. And I believe in the Christian life, there's kind of these two phases as well. The first is just the discovery. Finding for the first time the treasure that is the Christian message. One of my very favorite verses in the Bible is 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says this, God made him who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And this is the basic message. We're all sinners. As a result of our sin, the wages of sin is death. We are bound to die. We are bound to receive punishment. But here's what God did. God made him who had no sin. Who's that? It's Jesus. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. And the message of Christianity is this, that God knows every sin I ever have or will commit. He knows every sin you ever have or will commit. And what he did is he took those sins off us, he put them on Jesus, and he punished Jesus in our place. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And this is the beauty of it. Not only does God take all of our sin and put it on Jesus, which is why on the cross Jesus died. He was taking our punishment. God turned his face away. He was experiencing the hell that we deserve and the wrath of God that we deserve. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him, this is a great part, we might become the righteousness of Jesus. So God takes all of Jesus' righteousness and gives it to us. And if you understand that verse, talk about a deal. That is a deal of the millennium, so to speak. Are you saying that I can be considered as righteous as Jesus was righteous, and he'll just take the punishment? If you discover it, you'll just, wow, I can't believe that God would do something like that. It's unbelievable. That's the discovery phase. But then there's a second phase, which are called the possession phase, and it takes two parts. Ready for the two parts? Here they are. In order to possess this treasure, you've got to sell out and buy in. So what did this man do? In order to own the field, he had to sell all of his possessions. He had to look at his possessions and say, these are nothing in comparison to that. And that's what we have to do. We have to look at our relationships, our time, our work, our resources, everything that we think is valuable to us, and we have to say, you know what? None of that matters in comparison to getting Jesus. Like, it won't matter what I had or what I did or who I was with if in the end I don't get that? And you have to be willing, and you just have to think about this. What are the things that right now you're holding on to that prevent you from selling out so that you can buy in? And that's the second part. After you sell out, you have to just 100% completely surrender your life to Jesus and say, everything now, my very life, belongs to you. And those who trust and surrender in Jesus, they will not fail to have the righteousness of Jesus and wear those white clothes and be accepted by God for eternity. Now, when you hear me say you've got to sell out and buy in, there's some of you who are saying, boy, that's tough, because I have this relationship, or I have this thing, and it's hard for me to listen. If you really discover the treasure, it will not be difficult. Look what it says. He says, and then in joy went out, sold everything he had and bought the field. It wasn't difficult. It was like, oh man, I have to give up my house, and I have to give up my car, and I have to. No, I mean, he's like, who cares about this stuff? Look what I'm going to get. And those who are true Christians, it's the same way. Who cares about all the stuff of the world when what I get is it's unbelievable. Anyway, that's the first parable. Second parable, I won't spend much time on because it's almost exactly the same. And I'll just have you notice the first word. You can see that they're connected to each other. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away, sold everything he had, and bought it. Here I picture a man he's like a dealer of fine pearls, and he knows what he's looking at, and he's in the marketplace seeing what other people have to offer, and there's some new guy there who doesn't know what he's doing, and he happens to have, whoa, I can't believe it. This guy's got a $3 billion pearl he's selling for only $1 million. And, whoa, this guy doesn't realize what he has. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy that, but I got to go first. I'm going to sell everything I have so that I have the money so that I sell out and I buy in. Now, again, it's not difficult because what you gain is so much better than what you've sold away. It's so much better. Anyway, same process. There's a third parable. This third parable is tougher. In fact, a lot of times when I speak about the first two parables, I confess I've just left the third one out, but they go together. Here it is. You can see the words that link them together. Once again. So this is now all three of them belong together. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw away the bad. Then Jesus says, this is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into a blazing furnace where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This isn't an easy one. So I'm just going to say it straight, so to speak. So what's Jesus saying? He's saying the kingdom of heaven works like this, that in the church gathers up those who have found the treasure, who have discovered it, and they've sold out, and they've bought in, and they really possess it. There's other people who the church also brings in. They're somehow attracted. They like what's going on there. They're there, but they haven't done the same thing. They haven't personally sold out and bought in. So he's saying it's like a net because it just scoops people up together. And while they're in the net, it's indistinguishable. Like as I look out, I can't point and say, well, there's a good fish and there's a bad fish. I can't do that. No one can do that. In fact, no one here can do that because outwardly speaking, we're all in the net. But there's a reality, which is that although on the outside everything may look great, Jesus sees beyond the outward appearances to see what's really there. And it doesn't happen now, like in this life. It happens at the end, that there's a sorting. And the net's brought in, and all the church is gathered. But like a fisherman who separates the good and the bad fish, there are some who who they get thrown out, and the description, into the blazing furnace where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is what Jesus says is going to happen to those who haven't sold out and bought in, who are there, but they're not there. By the way, it's not the only place Jesus said something like this. Let me show you Matthew chapter 7. These are the words of Jesus. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." These next words are so chilling. "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then Jesus says, 'I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" I think the pronouns are what's important here, because these people are genuinely surprised. They say, did we? Like, I was in a church and there was great things happening there, and we were passionate, and we were teaching, and we were preaching, and we sent out missionaries, and we were planting churches, and we were public, and things were happening, and I was sitting there in the pew right next to them. Did we not do this? You see, we're all in the net. And because you're in the net, you have this sense of safety. Maybe we'll call it complacency. We're comfortable. We think we're in. But although the outward appearance looks good, there's an inner reality that only Jesus sees. And this call, wake up. Wake up. Hey, listen, I'd love to be able to say, I, Scott, can identify that the same problem that was happening in Sardis is a problem for the American church. I'd love to be able to say, but not at Sunlight. I'd love to be able to say that, but let's get real. It'd be a shame if some of you remember my words when you're hearing Jesus say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." If you're here today and you're hearing God speak to you, then I pray that the problem of complacency, the sense of security because you're there in a comfortable pew, will not keep you from what Jesus is calling you to recognize the treasure. Listen, it won't be difficult if you understand the gospel and you've discovered it. You can't not discover it. It's here. God made him who had no sin to be sin for you so that in him you might become the righteousness of. It's here. You've discovered it. Don't discover it and then walk away. Sell out and buy in.